Surgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us tonight Professor Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck. Nice to have you with us.
Always glad to be here.
Nice to have you with us. Well, we've talked about a lot of things in these. We had some conversations on our show, and they've centered on the American Constitution and the protections in that document for American citizens. And maybe we could discuss a little bit tonight about cruel and unusual punishments. Now, the Constitution makes reference to that, does it not?
Yes, it's probably one of the more famous lines from the Constitution, often uttered by secretaries whose bosses are just driving them too hard, and that sort of thing.
Yes.
It's the Eighth Amendment. It's a criminal provision. Its wording is drawn almost verbatim from the English Bill of Rights of 1689, and it simply says that no cruel and unusual punishments should be inflicted. And of course, the reason for that is because the English government was in fact inflicting punishments that a lot of dissenters thought were very cruel indeed.
Yes. Well, maybe we could discuss a little bit the Bill of Rights. I mean, maybe we should understand that the turn of phrase did not originate in America, but in our in the old country back in the UK, and that was the 1688 Glorious Revolution, and let's see, William of Orange came over. Did I get that right?
Very good.
And correct. And they threw out the Stuarts, and James was tossed out. He was a bad guy. By some lights, he was a bad guy.
Yes. So.
And and was there some relationship between Parliament? They insisted. I mean, did they not? The Whigs were pushing a little bit about what kind of rights the citizens of England deserved?
Yes, and it's not just, it didn't just bloom out of nowhere with the Glorious Revolution. There had been severe struggles for really the past 200 years in England as to which party was going to rule England. First of all, the Yorkists or the Lancastrians, and then the Tudors came in, and then there's a tussle between the Crown and Parliament for power. The Tudors were extremely powerful when then Parliament faded into the background, and then Parliament asserted itself so strongly by the mid-1600s that a king lost his head. But during all this, of course, there was a great deal of, I don't know if tyranny is too strong a word, but very heavy-handed use of the law, either by the Crown or by Parliament, in very arbitrary and nasty ways to work their will on their enemies.
Now, so if we're back in London, the year is 1688, and people talk about cruel, unusual punishment, people knew what they were talking about. There were hot irons, there were racks, and all sorts of terrible tortures. And so if someone were, I guess, they were wanted to convict them of a crime, they would torture a confession out of them, would they not? And people were revolted by this custom.
Indeed, and then the penalty, of course, once they use the hot irons to get the confession from you, if it was something like seditious libel or treason or something, there was, of course, the old favorite of drawing, hanging, and quartering at Tyburn, which I will simply, if you want to see an example of that, you can do no better than watch the last 15 minutes of Braveheart, because it's a pretty accurate rendition of drawing and quartering.
So, well, obviously, there were just terrible, barbaric things that occurred in the 17th century.
Yes.
And in the 18th century, when our forefathers created our country, they were concerned enough about this to put it in our Constitution. Is that correct?
That is correct. And of course, we had oppression of our own. We were very diverse as a group of colonies, but each little community was pretty much an entity unto itself. So it would be intolerant. So you would have Puritans and Catholics and Quakers, but within the Puritan colony, you'd better not be a Baptist, or you'd get horrible things done to you. So this is what the founders are drawing on when they put the Bill of Rights in, a list of things that the national government simply cannot do. And no cruel and unusual punishments.
Now, did that limit the states from inflicting cruel and unusual punishment? If the state of Georgia wanted to use hot irons or something, would
the federal Bill of Rights did not. Now, for instance, Virginia might have its own Bill of Rights with a similar prohibition.
Yes.
But originally, the government we feared was a strong, powerful national government. We were not afraid of our state governments because they were more within reach of us and more defensive of our rights, and we could change it more easily. So mainly it was the national government at
first. One could say that if some barbaric, if let's say Alabama, which is a nice state, but if they wanted to do some terrible some terrible crime against its citizens, torture them and flog them, and the U.S. Constitution would not preclude that from happening?
At the beginning, it would not. Not until, I can't remember the exact year when cruel and unusual punishment was incorporated, as the phrase goes, into the 14th Amendment against the states. But it was probably, and this is something I should have looked up before the show tonight, probably in the 1950s, certainly by the 1960s.
Well, was it illegal? Did the Constitution expand this? The reach of this turn of phrase by action of the court, or was it a constitutional amendment?
It was court action. What happened is, in the American Revolution, of course, it was the states that stood up to the powerful, evil central government in London. But then by 1860, the states were the bad guys because slavery was a matter of state law. So the 14th Amendment was ratified to restrict state power. It was a complete reversal of what had happened in the American Revolution. And by the 20th century, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, nor shall any state deny to any person the due process of law, was seen to incorporate the Bill of Rights, which meant that from that time on, the Bill of Rights provisions such as establishment of religion, freedom of speech, no search without warrant, was extended against the state governments as well.
Well, that's a rather interesting.
By the court action.
That's a rather interesting issue, isn't it? So we went through at least 100 years of our history with the states being able to do as they wish. But they generally had in their own constitutions restraints against cruel and unusual punishment.
Yes, as a matter of fact, the Federal Bill of Rights, which of course was ratified in 1791, was put together by Congress largely by drawing upon the pre-existing state bills of rights.
And I think particularly Virginia.
Virginia's and Massachusetts were two good ones,
a big proponent of that. Well, I think we've sort of bounced the basketball a little bit on this issue, and maybe just to keep at it, it's not spelled out exactly what cruel and unusual would be. And to quote one of our former presidents, what is. So these words can be very tricky. And can you comment on that? I mean, people did not want to be more specific. They threw a broad brush and comments about that. What is cruel and unusual? I mean, cruel is, any punishment could be construed as cruel.
Yes.
And unusual is, what would that be? I mean, they'd have to be the same, both the cruel and unusual, or is it unusual punishment along?
I believe it's conjunctive, so it would be cruel and unusual. I may be wrong about that, and I advise your readers to check me on that, or listeners. The court, and we seem to be deferring a whole lot to the court in the last 5 minutes because that's a big deal. But the court has, over the centuries, gone first one way and then another. At first, the Supreme Court tended to say if you had a punishment in place and generally accepted and not frowned upon at the time of the ratification of the Eighth Amendment in 1791, then that means it wasn't cruel. Right. But then the court, at other times, other justices would say basically what they call an evolving standards of decency standard. That it's not set in stone, and is that if we become more sensitive and more warm fuzzy, that we can change that definition to say.
Well, now could the courts, because the current phrase is so ambiguous, they could well flip it the other way, could they not? Which is something we maybe chat as we get into our discussion. So the courts could take it the other way. I mean, since it's not spelled out, the courts could say, by whatever standard, they could, I don't know, Sharia law. I mean, they could
Yes.
say, well, that's not, let's discuss Sharia law, having hands amputated or whatever.
Yes.
I mean, you could say unusual. It's certainly many parts of the world would be very usual.
Yes.
And what is cruel? I mean, if you have your hand amputated, well, you know, it's finished, and you can sort of wander off after you've lost your hand. On the other hand, you know, you're not put in prison. I mean, so
Yes.
maybe it's cruel, maybe it's not so cruel. I mean, could Sharia law be considered cruel and unusual?
This has me, of course, thinking about Murder on the Orient Express and Hercule Poirot as he's in Egypt and saying, let the Egyptians apply their own law to this.
Yes, yes.
It's none of our concern. And then,
Yes.
of course, finds himself in that same sort of situation
Right.
while on the Orient Express. You know, this gets to one of the most basic questions of authority and morality. It's Plato's Euthyphro dilemma. Does God say something is good because it is, or is something good because God says it is?
Yes.
If you truly believe that capital punishment, for instance, is a cruel thing,
Yes.
why do you believe that? Do you believe it because everybody in the country
Yes.
agrees with you? Can you point to a constituency and
yes.
say, you see, everybody thinks this is cruel?
Yes.
Or are you going to impose your own private morality on people and saying, I think this is cruel and therefore we're
Yes.
not going to do
Yes.
it, which is what Justice William Brennan wanted to
Yes.
do in the 1970s.
Well, now, yes, and in that, can you speak to that case? What did he want to
It
do?
was Furman versus Georgia. It was a capital punishment case, and the question was, is this cruel and unusual? And the court did decide in 1972 that as applied, capital punishment at that time was cruel and therefore unconstitutional. And the apparent reasoning was because it was arbitrarily imposed. It wasn't that it was an excessive punishment, but just that it was a game of spin the roulette wheel as to who got it. And of course, in Georgia, it was mostly black people,
Yes,
black
yes,
men who
yes,
got it.
right.
4 years later, when the states had all revamped their capital punishment laws to make them much less arbitrary, the court said, okay, it's no longer cruel. But Justice Brennan went on record as saying, I think that capital punishment per se is always cruel and therefore unconstitutional. Well, that's nice, Justice Brennan, but aren't you substituting your will for the will of the majority? Because 30 plus states have capital punishment.
Well, of course, that courts do it all the time, do
Yes.
they not? I mean, so we shouldn't be surprised if the courts take those steps. But we get into sort of a complicated thing about the way our world works
Yes.
here. If the court, it appears this language is so ambivalent and open to, I guess, discussion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for instance, it's cruel, if you're trying to parse this out, it's cruel, arbitrary. So there's a list of, cruel would be arbitrary, so it would be cruel to arbitrarily deny you whatever, I don't know what, an airplane ticket or
Yes.
something like that.
Yeah,
You were
the-
arbitrarily denied an airplane ticket because of whatever
Yes.
reason, ergo you. So it's
The
a pretty
best-
slippery slope, isn't it?
Yeah, the best guess is that it's some sort of intersection between arbitrary and excessive or disproportionate. So I think that arbitrary by itself wouldn't be cruel,
Yes.
but if it's arbitrary and excessive,
Yes.
then it might be cruel. But who decides what is excessive? Who
So we
decides
have all these vagaries
Yes.
that are left to the courts, and in general, I guess the American people sort of go along with courts as long as they think the process has been great care has been exercised in the court's decision. The court has not been prejudiced. There were great scholars, great wise men that spent hours and days in the lifetime coming up with how the law should work on these cases. That's what people would imagine is going on. But many times it's quite different, isn't it, about how they do things?
It was Bismarck who said one should not watch legislation or sausages being made, and I think the same thing holds true for court opinions, and especially if you adopt the idea of judicial legislation, that they are making laws, if you will, on the bench.
Now, well, one of the things that's out there, we talked just briefly about Sharia law,
Yes.
and would that be cruel and unusual? And that would be a pretty interesting conversation, would it not? For some people, it would not be. For some people, it would be a regular, normal kind of thing. So if some parts of the population said, well, this is okay, I mean, well, how does the court parse that out? And maybe the courts are arbitrary, just to use the wrong turn of phrase, they're arbitrary because they're using sort of Western world interpretation of cruel and arbitrary. Cruel and unusual. Yes. And so, ergo, that's arbitrary. I mean, if you see what I mean.
Exactly.
So I won't get too much into that. But one of the things that maybe we could discuss is cruel and unusual, and who that would apply to American citizens, to combatants, and particularly waterboarding. I mean, just thinking about that's something worth talking about a little bit. So it looks like in a state of war, or whatever, if you want to say we're in a state of, it's certainly an undeclared war, is it legal under the Constitution to waterboard people? And I mean, I've heard varying comments that, well, we just used a little water, a small amount, or whatever. We did it 300 times, 800 times, 700 times. With the Constitution and the general turn of phrase, cruel and unusual, allow the government to do whatever it wanted to, just like we're going to flip back to medieval times. So if the guys with these hoods came on, the great, they've got they're going to pull the nails out, and they've got all kinds of, here's the medieval torture chamber. Those guys would recognize possibly some of the torture methods that are being inflicted, on enemy combatants, admittedly so in Guantanamo and places like that. Now, how does the Constitution figure that out?
Well, you tend to think of cruel and unusual punishment, or at least my initial thought, is as a penal matter. You've been tried, you've convicted, and you've been sentenced. But you also have cases on the books, the 1963 case of Chambers versus Florida, when the court hears a case involving police interrogation techniques. And this is interrogation of someone who, I'm not even sure if he's officially been booked, much less been tried. And it's essentially psychological warfare, that you have a big mean guy walking around behind the chair hitting a rubber hose or a nightstick in order to coerce a confession. And the court said, no, that's out of bounds, that's no good. Of course, the difference of that is that person is in Florida. He's not in Guantanamo or on a battlefield in Afghanistan. And that raises the question of what happens if you're not a citizen, or if you are a citizen who is in a combat zone giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Have you waived your constitutional rights somehow?
Well, let's discuss maybe the way the Constitution works on this. You mentioned the Due Process Clause earlier, and we have how that's been attached to the phrase cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment. But I mean, is it okay? You can't, let's say, pull somebody's thumbnail out as punishment, but you could do it as interrogation. Does the Constitution allow cruel and unusual interrogation?
Certainly not in a domestic criminal setting.
Does it say it in the Constitution, or the courts?
Once again, the courts have all. With constitutional language, perforce has to be general, and somebody's got to fill in the generalities or explain them. And for the most part, it has been courts, and particularly the federal courts, that have done that over the years.
Well, that should be the strong. I mean, you could say, in general, logically, punishment is punishment. That would assume that you've been guilty of something, and maybe it would be slightly more permissible to pull your thumbnail out at that point. But if you're innocent, if you haven't been convicted of anything, and some kind of confession is attempted to be extracted, that would be even a more heinous turn of conduct, would it not?
And that, of course, is the Fifth Amendment, I believe, Fifth Amendment, that you're not, Sixth, that you're not compelled to give testimony against yourself. And so any sort of torture or anything like that could bring about such compulsion, this is where the first Miranda warning comes from. You have the right to remain silent. We're not going to pull out your thumbnails in order to get that confession. So I'm not sure if you could look at that as a cruel and unusual punishment case, but it certainly
so we have some. I'm happy to learn this, that our forefathers were worried about. Having the experience with all these rascally lords and dukes or whatever we dealt with.
Well,
back in
the
England.
Court of Star Chamber, I'm sure you've heard
Yeah,
of,
that was a very unpleasant. They do whatever they want to. You were star chambered, and people certainly did not.
Well, it's interesting. They can't. I found out they can't kill you in star chambered. Star chamber is a court of extraordinary equity, designed to reach people who are above the law. But of course, it got used for political purposes, but they couldn't kill you in Star Chamber. Now, they could pull out your thumbnail, subject you to hot irons, cut your ears off, and do any number of horrible things to you, probably making you wish you were dead, but they couldn't actually kill you.
So just to sort of, for our audience, just to discuss the Star Chamber issue, so this was I guess a legal instrument that had been employed by the Crown back in the UK.
Yes, 1300s, 1400s.
And they could just do anything they wanted to anyone. Yes. And so Parliament and the British courts over the years, and as well as the occasional revolution, restricted that substantially. Well, back to our situation in the States. The idea that we shouldn't, confessions should not be extracted by torture. And the courts are certainly on the side of that. And in a wartime situation, is there any, let's suppose it's a U.S. citizen, and does a U.S. citizen in a wartime situation have any standing to prevent this from happening? And if the confession has been extracted, is it an illegal confession? And can the victim seek compensation from the government that tortured him? Now, there's just a series of... Not an ad seriatim set of questions, but okay, all right, whatever.
These are a lot of questions that are still not resolved, but they're becoming more and more pointed as criminal domestic law enforcement and national security and battlefield war are all starting to merge, and it's largely a matter of technology that's happening. But and one of the classic examples I give, I think I've given on your show before, is to remember that Osama bin Laden was under federal indictment for the first World Trade Center bombing before September 11th. So does that mean that SEAL Team 6 should have brought a pair of handcuffs in with him and arrested him instead of shooting him? Now, of course, Osama bin Laden is not an American citizen, had no pretensions to that. But by the fact that he'd been named in an indictment, does that give him some sort of claim to due process? I think most Americans would certainly say, yes, absolutely shoot him. But what if he had been an American citizen by birth? Then it starts raising questions that we still don't have any good, clear answers for.
I think there's a lot of discussion out there, and I'm not wrong about this. There's been at least a document released by the Justice Department saying about when it is appropriate to kill an American citizen if they present imminent danger to the rest of the society. And I think the question, this is just a judicial kind of statement. I mean, this is what the Justice Department says we're going to do. We're going to kill you if we think there's you might do something bad. And apparently this is being contested because the idea of imminent is an overbroad kind of thing. But maybe I'll do it next decade. I've been thinking about it, and then somebody just shoots you.
Yes, nobody has really managed to quantify how immediate it is. It usually tends to be very, very immediate, seconds or moments or at the very most minutes. And of course, just because the Justice Department does that, you do have to realize that certainly at the senior levels, the Justice Department is largely the creature of the president, who can hire and fire pretty much at will. And especially if you get into the level of White House counsel or presidential counsel, essentially their job is to tell the president that he can do what the president has expressed that he wants to do, and then to make it sound all nice and judicial. But that's different from having a court hear the matter and litigate and rule on it.
Well, let's bounce the basketball a little bit on this. The idea that the government is in a situation of an undeclared war, and it has the privilege of torturing people, I would say that, and killing them if the government thinks they're a danger to other Americans. And right, that's a debatable question about how that occurs. We can all talk about that, and there are many opinions about it. But if this is happening, certainly the courts need to jump in there and require tremendous restraint, and there needs to be very strict limitations.
Yes.
And it should be a very temporary set of affairs. Now, are we getting a system put together where the overreach of the government is being very carefully adhered to, watched carefully? Are we?
Who watches the watchers? And of course, a lot of this stuff goes on now is classified and secret, and the government will say, we can't tell you what we did because it will compromise national security and future investigations. You just have to trust us on this. And that's a very dangerous state of affairs. And since we are at war not against a people or recognizable state, but against a strategy, if you will, a tactic, the big question that we ought to ask is, we ought to ask this of every politician. We ought to ask it of President Obama. How do you win the war on terror? How do you know when you've won? Because I don't think they can answer that, and that is a very dangerous state of affairs for civil liberties.
Well, let me just make a comment about what terror is. Yes. What is terror? I mean, so if it's a very interesting turn of word, and it's been many people say the Nazis use that word to say this is a terrorist. What exactly is it? And I think people can certainly say 9/11 was a terror act.
Yes.
But is it where does it end? Where does it stop? Is it an undeclared war? Is this guerrilla activity? Are people sort of like, you could say any movement against a particular government is exercising violent action?
Yes.
And I'm just a little uncomfortable with the broad brush of terror.
Yes, at what point does crime become terrorism, become war? And of course, if we look at the provenance of the term, that it really came into popular use in English during the Reign of Terror, when the terrorists were the government. They weren't people who were trying to rebel against a government.
Yes.
The terrorist was the new revolutionary government of France itself, and that's a scary concept.
So we could parse this out a little bit about what terror is and isn't. And sometimes the government can use terror against its own citizens to compel them to act in a certain way.
Yes.
Something bad is going to happen. We're going to come arrest you tonight.
Yes.
And it's very important that the citizens restrain government activities and watch the government like a hawk. Is that wrong for us to say this on television? I hope the government's listening, maybe.
That America,
we're going to watch you like a hawk.
The thing that gave birth to America was a rebellion against a government which the revolutionaries believed had become oppressive and gone too far. So to think that it is un-American to distrust the government, especially the federal government, is to forget the very founding of this country.
We just have to watch those guys carefully and closely, and I think they'll behave.
Yes.
In any event, thank you so much for coming tonight to Bucky, and we'll have some more chats. Thank you. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions.